The dust of the training range curled in faint brown spirals across the dry wind as the group of soldiers lounged near the firing pits, their voices sharp with laughter. They were young men, mostly brash and loud, dressed in fatigues with rifles slung over their shoulders. Every one of them carried sleek, polished weapons, long-barreled sniper systems built with the newest optics, the kind that cost a fortune to maintain and carried the prestige of modern engineering. Among them, standing with her boots pressed into the packed earth, was Alina Vey, the lone woman in the squad and the only one carrying what they called a farm gun. Her rifle was old, scratched, its paint chipped down to the dull steel beneath. The stock had been patched once with tape and a strip of leather, and its scope looked as though it had been pulled off a museum relic. It wasn't just outdated, it was a joke to them. They didn't bother to hide their smirks, or the sideways comments they thought she couldn't hear. She heard every one of them. "She'll be lucky to hit a barrel at 500 yards with that thing," one muttered, spitting into the dirt. Another laughed, "Low-end rifle, low-end shooter." Their voices cut through the air like gnats, buzzing around her, but Alina didn't rise to it. She stood still, calm, her gloved hand resting on the old bolt handle as if she and the weapon had been born together. The weapon was battered, yes, but every groove, every scrape carried a memory. They didn't know that she had trained with it since childhood, that she had rebuilt its parts with her father in the dim light of a workshop when she was barely tall enough to see the bench. They didn't know the countless hours of dawn practice, the nights she had spent lying prone in wet fields, learning to breathe with the earth, learning patience. They only saw a relic and assumed its user was equally broken. The commanding officer, a lean figure with sharp eyes and an easy authority, barked for silence and brought the squad into line. Today was a competition, he reminded them, a long-range trial to test precision under stress. Targets were set at staggered distances. 1 mile, 1.5, and the last for anyone bold enough to try at 2 miles exactly. The desert stretched flat and merciless, the targets glinting in the heat haze like pale dots, nearly invisible to the naked eye. The men grinned and adjusted their fancy optics, whispering wagers about who would outshoot whom. They didn't even include Alina in their bets. She was an afterthought, a shadow in their company. That suited her. She knelt and set her rifle across the sandbag rest, sliding into position with a slow, deliberate grace. The rifle settled into her shoulder as though it had always belonged there. Her cheek pressed against the worn stock, and the smell of oil and steel filled her lungs like something familiar, comforting. Around her, the others were still laughing, checking the dials on their scopes, boasting about windage calculations. She ignored them all. The only thing she paid attention to was the wind whispering across the range, tugging at the ends of her hair, shifting the grains of dust. She felt it more than she measured it, the way a sailor feels the sea through the soles of his boots. The shooting began. The first man fired, the crack of his rifle sharp, the recoil snapping his shoulder. Through his scope, he saw his round strike the first target at a mile, slightly off-center but enough to score. Cheers went up. Another fired, and the competition surged with noise and the smell of cordite. Their bullets kicked up faint puffs of sand, some striking home, some missing, but always followed by laughter or curses, never silence. When Alina's turn came, there was a lull, a brief pause filled with expectation of failure. She slid the bolt back, chambered around with a smooth, practiced motion, and let her breath fall shallow. The crosshairs wavered over the distant steel plate, a shimmering ghost in the desert heat. She slowed her heartbeat, her body sinking into stillness, and squeezed the trigger. The old rifle barked with a deeper, rawer sound than the modern guns, a sound that carried history in its echo. A second later, the faint metallic clang rolled back across the desert. She had struck the plate dead center at a mile. The laughter faltered. Someone muttered, "Beginner's luck." She didn't look at them. She racked the bolt again, the action smooth as if the weapon itself was proud to prove its worth. The next target lay farther, smaller, distorted by heat shimmer. She steadied her breathing, adjusted her hold, and fired. The delay was longer this time, the weight stretched thin, but then the sound returned, clang. Another hit. The men exchanged uneasy glances now, their smiles curdling. The officer's expression tightened with interest. Alina remained still, her face unreadable, though inside she felt the quiet bloom of satisfaction. Not triumph, not arrogance, just the settling of truth. The rifle was not low-end. It was a companion, an extension of her eye and breath. She knew its quirks, the way the trigger broke just before the shot, the subtle drift of its barrel when the heat rose. She trusted it as one trusts a heartbeat. The final target was set at 2 miles, an almost impossible distance. Even the most advanced rifles struggled there. The earth curved, the wind shifted, the mirage distorted light itself. To strike such a target was to test not only skill but a kind of communion with the environment. The men scoffed openly now, as if daring her to embarrass herself. "She won't even see the damn thing," one laughed, though his voice was thinner than before. Alina ignored them all. She adjusted her position slightly, settling her elbows deeper into the sand. Her breathing slowed until it was nearly imperceptible. The scope's glass swam with distortion, the target a flickering phantom. She listened to the wind, not just at her cheek but across the range, the way the heat shimmer told stories of rising currents. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, letting everything else fall away, the voices, the doubt, the weight of being underestimated. There was only her, the rifle, and the line between them and that speck of steel 2 miles away. Her finger brushed the trigger, not pressing yet, just feeling the familiar curve of it. She inhaled once, slowly, then let it out in the kind of controlled release that years of practice had burned into her bones. She pressed. The rifle roared, bucking against her shoulder, echoing across the range. The bullets sailed invisibly, arcing through heat and wind, vanishing into distance. Time stretched thin, every second a held breath across the entire squad. Then, faint and impossibly distant, came the sound. A hollow, ringing note, clear as a bell across 2 miles of desert. Clang. Dead center. Perfect. For a long, suspended moment there was nothing. No laughter, no jeers, not even breath. The men stood frozen, mouths slightly open, their expensive rifles hanging forgotten at their sides. The silence was louder than any cheer could have been. Alina lifted her head from the stock, exhaled softly, and worked the bolt with a smooth, calm motion. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. The silence told her everything. The officer's eyes shone with something sharper than approval, something like awe. The others avoided her gaze, their bravado shattered, their mocking gone. For the first time since she had joined them, the field belonged to her. She laid the rifle across her lap, one hand resting lightly on its worn stock, and allowed herself a single, small smile. Not for them, but for her father, for the long nights, for the years of being overlooked. The desert wind carried it away, leaving only silence, the kind of silence earned at 2 miles away. The silence on the range lingered like a storm cloud that had failed to break. For several long heartbeats, no one moved, no one dared speak. Alina remained seated, her hands calm on the rifle as though what she had just accomplished was ordinary, expected, almost routine. The others shifted uneasily, their boots scraping against the packed earth, their laughter gone and replaced by a silence that carried weight. The commanding officer cleared his throat, a small sound, but in that stillness it was enough to make every head turn. His eyes lingered on her longer than the rest, and though his face gave little away, there was something in his look that spoke of recalculation, as though the charts he had carried in his head about every member of his squad had just been rewritten. One of the men, broad-shouldered and arrogant, muttered under his breath, "Must have been a fluke." But the words carried no strength, no conviction, and even he seemed to know it. The clang of her bullet on the farthest plate still echoed in their minds, undeniable, unshakable. When the trial ended and the targets were called, Alina rose quietly, brushing the grit from her fatigues, slinging her battered rifle across her back with the ease of someone carrying a trusted tool rather than a burden. The others gathered their equipment with forced chatter, their jokes brittle, their voices pitched too high. No one mentioned the 2-mile shot, not directly. They avoided it as though silence might erase what had happened. But silence was its own admission. Alina walked among them unnoticed, or so it seemed, but she could feel their glances brushing against her back, sharp and measuring now rather than dismissive. She neither quickened nor slowed her steps. She had lived her life beneath the shadow of doubt and derision, and this was not the first time the weight of their underestimation had shifted. She had grown used to it, the sudden change from ridicule to respect, but she never sought it. What she wanted was not their admiration. It was the shot itself, the perfection of it, the unbroken line between breath, trigger, and distant steel. That night, as the squad gathered in the mess hall, their trays clattering on metal tables, the memory of the range still hung in the air like smoke. Conversations tried to form, jokes tried to surface, but they always faltered when eyes drifted toward her. She sat at the far edge, eating in silence, her focus on the simple rhythm of fork to plate, bite to mouth. The old rifle rested back in her quarters, cleaned and oiled, lying on her bunk like a quiet companion. Across the hall she could hear snippets of hushed voices. 2 miles, one said low and incredulous. With that junk piece, another whispered. No one makes that shot. The voices faded quickly whenever they realized she might hear. Alina didn't mind. Let them whisper. The desert had whispered louder truths to her for years, truths she trusted more than the chatter of soldiers. But the officer had not forgotten. The following morning, as the squad assembled in the courtyard under a blazing sun, he called her forward. His tone was measured, carrying authority without flourish. "Vey," he said, using her surname as was custom. "Report to me after drills." The men glanced at each other, puzzled, curious. Alina simply nodded, a short motion, no more. She completed the morning drills in silence, her body moving through the exercises with the economy of someone who conserved strength for things that mattered. When the drills ended and the others filed away toward the barracks, she broke off and followed the officer to his office. It was a small room, functional, with maps pinned to the walls and a faint smell of gun oil clinging to the air. He gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That shot," he said finally. 2 miles. How many times have you done it?" She met his gaze, calm, steady. Enough to know it wasn't luck. His brow twitched, the closest he came to surprise. "Your rifle," he continued, glancing toward the door as though he could see the battered weapon resting in her quarters. "It's obsolete. By every measure, it shouldn't be capable of that precision." She allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "It isn't the rifle. It never was." His silence stretched, then he leaned back slowly as though weighing something invisible. "There are assignments," he said carefully. "Ones that require accuracy beyond what the rest of this unit can provide. I'll be watching." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging but not boasting, and left without another word. Word of her private meeting spread faster than she would have liked. The next days on the range were different. No one laughed at her rifle anymore. Instead, they watched her, eyes narrowing as though trying to unravel the secret she carried. A few tried to mimic her stillness, her breathing, the way she handled the weapon, but none could replicate the bond she had with it. They didn't understand that it wasn't in the mechanics alone but in the years of rhythm, the patience learned in the solitude of fields where no one applauded and no one mocked, where the only measure of success was the ring of steel on a lonely hill. They still thought in terms of technology, of equipment, of optics and dials. They couldn't see that the weapon was merely an extension of the shooter, and that she had fused with hers long ago. The tension grew with each passing day. Some of the men grew resentful, whispering that she was being favored now, that the officer was giving her more attention. Others, quieter, seemed almost reverent, as though they had witnessed something they couldn't deny and now respected it, though grudgingly. Alina ignored it all. She focused on practice, on listening to the wind, on the feel of her trigger. If they wanted to watch, let them. If they wanted to stew in their jealousy, let them. She had no time for their fragile pride. What mattered was readiness, and she sensed that something was shifting in the air. The officer's interest wasn't idle. Assignments of the kind he hinted at meant operations, real missions where failure wasn't measured in missed steel plates but in blood. One evening, as the sun bled red across the desert horizon, Alina returned to the range alone. The others were in the barracks or the hall, their laughter faint in the distance. She lay prone in the dust, her rifle steady before her, the targets barely visible in the fading light. She didn't need them to be clear. She closed her eyes, breathed, listened. The wind shifted cool across her cheek. She opened her eyes again, aligned the crosshairs and fired. The rifle spoke in its raw, thunderous voice. The distant target rang out. She reloaded, fired again. Another clang. The world dimmed into twilight, the stars beginning to press their pale light against the sky, but still she fired, each shot folding into the silence until it was not a test, not practice, but a prayer. Every clang was a reminder of who she was, of what she had built through years of discipline, of the bond between her and the battered weapon no one else believed in. By the time she returned to her quarters, the camp was quiet. She cleaned the rifle in silence, each motion precise, deliberate, like ritual. She knew tomorrow would not be like today. The officer's eyes had spoken it. Something was coming. And when it came, she would be ready. The summons came 2 days later, delivered not by the commanding officer himself but by a runner who appeared at her door just after dawn. The young soldier's face was pale, his voice clipped with nerves as he said, "Vey, report to briefing room 3. Immediately." Alina thanked him with a nod and closed the door behind her. She had slept lightly the night before, sensing the shift, and her rifle was already cleaned, packed, and slung across her shoulder. The walk across the compound was brisk, the rising sun painting the desert in harsh gold. Soldiers stirred around her, some heading toward drills, others gathered in knots of conversation, but their voices lowered when she passed. She could feel the weight of their attention, their curiosity, but she let it slide off her like water off stone. Briefing Room 3 waited at the far end of the command building, a steel door guarded by 2 armed men who stepped aside when she approached. Inside, the air was cool, the walls lined with maps and digital projections glowing faint blue. At the center of the room stood the officer, flanked by 2 other commanders she had not seen before. Their eyes flicked over her as she entered, measuring, testing, and she met their gaze with steady calm. "They," her officer began, gesturing for her to step closer. "We have an operation. High risk. Precision required. You've been chosen." His voice carried none of the casual tone he used on the range. This was sharp, clipped, weighted. The maps lit up behind him, showing terrain that stretched into enemy territory, jagged ridges, broken valleys, a network of roads where convoys moved like veins of steel. "Intelligence has confirmed the presence of a high-value target. A commander who has been orchestrating strikes across our borders. He's on the move, heavily guarded, but vulnerable for a narrow window. We need a shot taken at extreme distance, beyond what any of our current equipment has successfully achieved in live combat." His gaze locked with hers. "That's where you come in." She absorbed the words in silence, her mind already turning, imagining the terrain, the distances, the winds that would shape the shot. She didn't ask why her. She didn't need to. The clang of steel 2 miles away still echoed in the minds of these men. That had been her answer before the question was ever spoken. One of the unfamiliar commanders leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Sir, with all respect, she uses an outdated weapon. We have cutting-edge rifles, the best optics available. Are we truly assigning this to her?" The disdain was subtle but present, a shadow in his tone. Alina kept her gaze steady on him, offering no reaction, but inside she recognized the familiar cadence of doubt. She had lived under it her entire life and it no longer stung. The officer cut off the objection with a firm hand. "She has proven capable. Equipment is only as good as the one who wields it. She will take the shot." There was no more discussion. Orders were given, coordinates exchanged, and Alina was dismissed with the weight of the mission settling across her shoulders like a cloak. Outside, the desert wind brushed her face, carrying the scent of dust and heat. She drew in a long breath and let it out slowly. The mission was dangerous, perhaps nearly impossible. But impossibility had never deterred her. She lived for the edge where others faltered. Preparation began at once. She stripped her rifle down piece by piece, examining every spring, every groove, every worn patch of steel. She polished it until it gleamed dully, functional rather than beautiful. She checked the scope, cleaned the lenses, adjusted the tension of the mounts. Others might have replaced parts, tried to modernize, but she knew better. Every scar on the weapon was familiar, every imperfection accounted for in her calculations. Changing it would mean breaking the bond. She packed carefully, ammunition, cleaning kit, spare rations, water. No excess, no wasted weight. The convoy that would carry her toward the drop point rumbled to life before dawn the next day. Soldiers clambered aboard armored trucks, weapons slung casually, chatter sharp with anticipation. Alina climbed in silently, her rifle cradled across her lap, her eyes already scanning the horizon as though she could see the target that lay days away. The men avoided her gaze, some out of lingering resentment, some out of a new, uneasy respect. She preferred it that way. Words were useless now. Only the shot would matter. The journey was long and brutal. The desert stretched endless, heat shimmering in waves, sand stinging against exposed skin. Convoys kicked up storms of dust that clung to clothes and choked lungs. At night, the cold sank deep, stars blazing cruelly overhead. They traveled through hostile territory, always alert for ambushes, their weapons at the ready. Alina sat quietly, conserving her strength, her rifle never leaving her hands. Once, a soldier across from her leaned forward, curiosity breaking through his caution. "How do you do it?" he asked softly. "That shot. 2 miles. No one can explain it." His words carried no mockery, only genuine wonder. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back out at the desert. "You listen," she said simply. He frowned, confused. "Listen to what?" She did not answer. Some truths could not be explained. They had to be lived, felt in the bones, in the breath, in the silence between heartbeat and trigger pull. By the time they reached the drop point, Alina felt the shift in the air, the prickling awareness of danger near. The convoy stopped in a shallow valley, engines idling while scouts went ahead. She disembarked quietly, stretching her stiff limbs, scanning the jagged ridges that rose around them. The target was expected to move along a road that cut through those ridges, escorted by armored vehicles. It would be her job to position herself, to wait, to take the shot before the convoy disappeared into cover again. The distance would be extreme, over 2 miles, across shifting winds and broken terrain. She would have only one chance. The squad leader explained the plan in curt tones, his words sharp and efficient. Alina listened, nodded once, and set off toward the chosen ridge with 2 spotters assigned to her. They carried advanced optics, range finders, communications gear. They looked at her rifle and exchanged skeptical glances but said nothing. She didn't need their approval. She only needed their silence when the time came. Climbing the ridge was brutal, the rock sharp beneath her boots, the sun beating down with merciless heat. Sweat traced lines down her temples, her breath steady despite the exertion. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone who conserved every ounce of energy for the moment that mattered. At the top, she lay prone, the world sprawling before her in waves of sand and stone. The road cut through the valley below, a thin scar of steel and dust. The spotters set up beside her, whispering calculations, calling wind speeds, distances, angles. Their voices were clipped, precise, but to Alina they were background noise. She closed her eyes, let the desert speak. The wind tugged gently at her cheek, shifted subtly over the rocks, carried scents of dust and oil. She opened her eyes, set the crosshairs on the empty road, and waited. Time stretched, the sun arcing slowly, heat shimmering into mirages. Hours passed. She did not move. She became stone, breath shallow, heartbeat slow, eyes fixed. The others shifted restlessly, wiped sweat, checked their equipment again and again. She remained still as though carved into the ridge itself. Then at last the convoy appeared. Dust rose in plumes, engines growled faintly through the air, armored vehicles glinting like insects in the sun. The target's vehicle, heavier, darker, moved in the center. The spotters whispered rapidly, adjusting calculations, marking distance. 2 miles and change. Nearly impossible. Alina listened, then tuned them out. She adjusted her grip, her cheek pressing against the stock, her eye steady through the worn scope. The world narrowed into a single line between her and the target. The laughter of soldiers, the doubts of commanders, the years of training in silent fields, everything led here. She inhaled slowly, felt her lungs expand, then released the breath with perfect control. Her finger touched the trigger, not pressing yet, simply resting. The moment had come. The convoy moved steadily through the valley, engines growling like a slow heartbeat beneath the desert sun. Dust plumes trailed behind the armored vehicles, rising in lazy spirals that blurred the horizon. Through the scope, the heat shimmer turned metal into ghosts, shifting and wavering, but Alina's eye never left the darkened vehicle at the center. That was the target, the commander whose orders had left villages burning, who had orchestrated ambushes that claimed lives on both sides. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat steadied. Around her, the spotters whispered urgently, numbers spilling in a tense rhythm. Wind 5 knots east, range 2.1 miles, mirage heavy, adjust. Their words were sharp, professional, but they were chasing precision with instruments and mathematics. Alina listened, acknowledged, and then let their chatter drift into the background. Her precision came from something else, something older. She felt the pull of the wind on her skin, the faint taste of dust on her tongue, the subtle way heat rose in shimmering curtains across the valley floor. She didn't calculate it, she knew it, the way one knows when rain will fall by the smell of the air. She shifted slightly, aligning the battered scope with the convoy's center. The crosshairs trembled for a heartbeat, then stilled. Her finger rested against the trigger, patient, waiting. The vehicle moved into her line of fire, a fleeting window between 2 jagged ridges. The spotters held their breath, their range finders steady, sweat dripping from their brows. Alina inhaled, let it out slowly, and pressed. The rifle cracked, its thunder rolling across the ridge. Recoil bit into her shoulder, familiar, grounding. Through the scope, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, at that impossible distance, the bullet struck home. The armored vehicle jolted violently, smoke burst from the hood, and chaos erupted in the convoy. Soldiers scrambled from the other trucks, shouting, weapons swinging toward the ridge, though they could not possibly see her from so far. The spotters gasped in disbelief, their eyes wide. "Hit!" one shouted, almost unable to believe his own voice. "Direct hit." But Alina was already working the bolt, chambering the next round, steady as stone. The convoy scattered, some vehicles braking hard, others accelerating to push the target out of reach. She tracked the dark vehicle again, its movements frantic, erratic. Dust plumed thicker now, engines roaring. She adjusted, felt the wind shift, fired again. Another crack, another second stretched into eternity, and then the second round slammed into the rear of the commander's transport. Flames leapt skyward. Through the scope she could see figures scrambling out, smoke cloaking their escape. The target staggered into view, a man heavily guarded, shielded by soldiers who dragged him toward cover. The spotters shouted coordinates, voices high with urgency, but Alina ignored them. Her focus was razor-thin, locked on that single figure amid the chaos. She adjusted one final time, breath steady, finger poised. The third shot roared across the valley. Silence stretched. Then the target dropped, his body folding into the dust. The soldiers around him froze in shock, then scrambled desperately to drag him back, but it was already over. 2 miles away, Alina exhaled, her expression calm, unreadable. The spotters sat in stunned silence, their equipment forgotten, their eyes flicking between her and the carnage below. The radio crackled alive in their ears, commanders demanding confirmation. One of the spotters answered, voice trembling with adrenaline. Target neutralized. Repeat, target neutralized. Shot confirmed at over 2 miles. Static hissed, then the officer's voice came through, sharp and controlled. Excellent work. Extract immediately. Enemy reinforcements are inbound. Alina didn't move yet. She kept her eye on the scope for another long breath, confirming what she already knew. The man lay motionless, the convoy fractured into chaos. Only then did she pull back, sliding the rifle against her shoulder, her motions calm, precise, without rush. The spotters were scrambling to pack their gear, fear spiking their voices as the low growl of enemy vehicles echoed faintly in the distance. Come on, we have to go, one hissed. Alina nodded once, rose smoothly and began the descent down the ridge. The climb down was brutal, jagged rocks tearing at boots, dust-choking lungs. Behind them, the engines of enemy reinforcements grew louder, the sound vibrating through the earth. Alina moved steadily, her rifle strapped tight, every step measured. The spotters stumbled, cursed, hurried, their nerves fraying. When they reached the base, the extraction team was waiting, engines already revving. Soldiers waved frantically. Move, move, move. Bullets cracked across the valley as enemy troops spotted them, rounds slamming into rock, throwing up shards of stone. Alina dove behind cover, returned fire with sharp, precise bursts, each shot deliberate. She was not frantic, not rushed. Every bullet she fired struck true, pinning enemies down, buying seconds. The extraction truck roared closer, its gunner opening fire to suppress the pursuers. The spotters scrambled aboard first, dragging their gear, shouting for her. Alina fired one last round, dropped an enemy soldier mid-sprint, then vaulted into the truck bed as it lurched into motion. The ride back was a storm of dust and gunfire. Enemy vehicles chased them across the valley, rounds sparking off armored plates, the air filled with the stench of smoke and cordite. Alina crouched low, rifle ready, eyes scanning. She fired in short bursts, picking off drivers, crippling enemy vehicles one by one. Each time she struck, the pursuers faltered, vehicles spinning out in plumes of dust. The truck rocked violently as it careened over uneven ground, but Alina's balance never broke. Her calm presence seemed to settle even the panicked spotters, who clung to the sides with white knuckles. Slowly, relentlessly, the enemy pursuit thinned until only silence and the growl of their own engine remained. The desert swallowed the echoes of battle. They had escaped. When they returned to base, the atmosphere was electric. Soldiers gathered as the convoy rolled in, eyes wide, voices buzzing with the news that had already spread ahead of them. 2 miles, they whispered. She hit him from 2 miles. The disbelief that had once wrapped around her was gone, burned away by proof no one could deny. Even those who had mocked her rifle now looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, as though she were something other than human. Alina ignored the stares. She stepped down from the truck, her boots hitting the earth with steady weight, and walked past them without a word. Her officer was waiting, his expression taut but his eyes lit with something fierce. "Vey," he said, voice sharp with respect. "You did it. Clean, precise, decisive. You've changed the game." She inclined her head slightly, offering nothing more. She had no need for praise. The shot spoke louder than any words ever could. That night, alone in her quarters, she laid the rifle across her lap and cleaned it by lamplight. Her hands moved steadily, oiling the worn steel, wiping dust from the scope. She thought of the man 2 miles away, the way he had crumpled into the earth, the silence that followed. There was no triumph in her heart, no exultation. Only a quiet weight, the knowledge of what her skill could do, the line between necessity and destruction. She whispered softly to the rifle, words no one else would ever hear, a ritual between her and the weapon that had carried her through. Outside, the camp roared with celebration, with stories already twisting into legend. But she sat in silence, her hands steady, her breath calm. Tomorrow there would be another mission, another shot. Tonight, there was only the echo of steel ringing across impossible distance, and the silence that followed. The echo of the last shot still lingered in the valley when Alina lowered her rifle. Smoke curled faintly from the barrel, mixing with the chill morning air. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Around her, the mercenary camp, once buzzing with cocky laughter and careless banter, was utterly still. No one spoke. No one dared to. The men who had mocked her for carrying what they called a rusted museum piece now stared at her as if she had transformed into something otherworldly. A 2-mile hit. Impossible, they had said. Impractical, they had claimed. Luck, some would still whisper later. But Alina knew, and so did they, that luck alone could never stretch that far, never factor wind shifts invisible to the eye, never bend trajectory to perfection. It had been skill hard-earned through years of isolation, training, and obsession. One of the mercenaries, a grizzled veteran named Roke, finally broke the silence. His voice was rough, but not with derision this time. That was no accident. He stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. You just made that shot with iron sights and a rifle older than me. Alina didn't look up. She was still steadying her breath, still listening to the way the world seemed to hum in her veins after a perfect strike. When she finally glanced at Roke, her face was calm, unreadable. Doubt is natural, she said softly. But results don't lie. A ripple moved through the group. Some nodded in grudging respect. Others looked away, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with their pride. Among them was Cashin, the young sharpshooter who had been loudest in mocking her earlier. His prized high-tech rifle with its digital optics now seemed like a toy compared to the battered relic in her hands. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as he realized his reputation had been shattered in a single breath. Don't think this makes you better than me, Cashin spat suddenly, his pride lashing out. One shot doesn't change the fact that you're just lucky. That rifle's still junk and you? Roke cut him off sharply. Enough. His gaze turned to Cashin, hard as stone. You couldn't have made that shot with every drone and scope in the world guiding you. You saw it. We all did. Luck doesn't carry a bullet that far. The camp fell quiet again. Even Cashin, red with humiliation, had no comeback. But Alina didn't revel in their silence. She felt no need to gloat. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the distant ridge where her bullet had struck, her thoughts far from their petty rivalries. She hadn't come here to prove herself to these men, though their scorn had forced her hand. No, her purpose was larger, heavier, and far more dangerous. The shot she had just made was practice, nothing more. A test to remind herself of the precision she would soon need, because the real target was not a metal plate or a wager. It was a man. And not just any man. General Kale. The name alone carried weight, spoken in low tones across battlefields and villages alike. To the mercenaries he was untouchable, a commander surrounded by layers of protection, armored convoys and legions of loyal soldiers. To Alina, he was something else entirely, the reason her village had burned, the ghost behind every sleepless night she endured, the architect of the loss that had carved her into the person she was now. Her hands tightened briefly on the rifle, feeling the familiar grooves in the worn wood. This weapon had survived longer than empires. It had passed from her father to her, each scratch a story, each dent a reminder of survival. They had called it outdated, mocked it as worthless. But it had been enough to keep her alive when everything else had been stripped away. And now it would be enough to bring down Kale. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her coat. I didn't come here to impress you, she said, her voice carrying across the camp. I came here for a contract. You've seen what I can do. Decide now if you'll take me seriously or step aside. Her words lingered like frost in the air. Roke was the first to nod. He was not a man easily swayed, but neither was he foolish. You've got my respect, he said, and a murmur of agreement followed from several others. But Cashin remained silent, smoldering with resentment. Alina ignored him. She had no time for bruised egos. The path ahead would demand more focus than ever before. The 2-mile shot had been difficult, but it was nothing compared to the one she was preparing for. To reach Kale, she would need to infiltrate the mountains where his stronghold lay hidden, dodge the patrols and sensors that blanketed the terrain, and find the vantage point from which a single, impossible shot could end the war he had kindled. Night fell heavy that evening, the mercenary camp lit by the glow of scattered fires. Alina sat alone, cleaning her rifle with deliberate care, each motion steady and practiced. Around her, conversations buzzed in low tones. Some spoke of her with awe, others with suspicion. But none dared laugh anymore. As she worked, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. Cashin. She knew his type, the young ones who had never truly tasted failure until it bit deep. His pride would not allow this to rest. In the shadows, she could almost hear the grinding of his teeth as he watched her, plotting some way to reclaim the dignity she had stripped from him. But Alina paid him no mind. She was not here for games of pride. She was here for Kale. Laying the rifle across her lap, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the distant sounds of the night fold into her senses. Somewhere in those mountains, Kale was sleeping in the false safety of his fortress. Somewhere out there, her bullet already waited for him, silent, patient, inevitable. When her eyes opened again, there was no hesitation left in them. The 2-mile shot had silenced their doubts. But the next one would silence a tyrant. The desert night had grown colder, a biting wind whispering through the rocks where Aisha and the unit had taken cover. The victory of the ambush still hung in the air, but beneath it lay a heavy silence that was not entirely celebratory. The men who had once mocked her low-end rifle were no longer laughing. They sat around the small, flickering flames of their makeshift fire, staring at her as though she were something far beyond their comprehension. Aisha herself sat a little apart, cross-legged on the sand, her rifle across her lap as if it were simply another limb of her body. She said nothing, and perhaps that was what unnerved them most. Keller finally broke the silence. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his sharp eyes narrowing as though he were trying to peel away the layers of mystery surrounding her. 2 miles, he said at last, his voice low but carrying weight. You hit from 2 miles away with that thing. Do you even realize what you just did? Aisha looked up slowly. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight, calm and unshaken. It was necessary, she replied simply. Her tone was flat, not boastful, not proud, merely a statement of fact. That steadiness struck the others more than any celebration could have. They shifted uncomfortably, as though her composure reminded them how fragile their own nerves were. One of the younger soldiers, still wide-eyed from the fight, couldn't hold back his question. But how? I mean, that shot, it's impossible. The wind alone would... His voice trailed off, searching for words, but his disbelief was written all over his face. Aisha lifted the rifle and laid it gently on her knees, running a hand along its worn barrel. You see an old weapon, she said. I see every scratch, every dent, every adjustment made with my own hands. I know it better than I know myself. It has never failed me because I never expect it to do more than it can. The rest is patience, calculation, and knowing the silence between breaths. Her words hung in the air like the echo of a bell. For the first time, Keller leaned back as if reassessing everything he thought he knew about her. The others exchanged glances, not daring to challenge her explanation. The desert stretched endlessly around them, stars sharp and cold above. The fire hissed softly as a gust of wind carried sparks into the night. Aisha stayed still, her gaze fixed on the horizon where darkness swallowed the sand. In her mind she replayed the shot, not as triumph but as necessity. A single choice that had shifted the balance of survival in their favor, at least for now. But the fight wasn't over. They all knew it. Scouts reported that the enemy, though rattled, was regrouping and reinforcements were expected by dawn. Every man around the fire understood that their survival rested on slim chances. They had supplies enough for perhaps 2 days, ammunition that was already running low, and the crushing weight of being outnumbered. The only thing they had that the enemy didn't was her. Later that night, when the others drifted into uneasy sleep, Keller remained awake, watching Aisha. He couldn't shake the image of that shot, how she had waited, motionless, for the perfect moment, then fired with absolute certainty. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even skill in the way most soldiers understood it. It was something deeper, something almost unnatural. He finally spoke again, his voice low so as not to wake the others. Who taught you? Aisha didn't turn her head. Her eyes stayed on the desert horizon. The desert itself, she answered. And silence. Both are harsher teachers than any man could be. Keller frowned. That's not an answer. She tilted her head slightly, considering. Then after a long pause she said, When I was a child, I had nothing but this rifle and the open land. The world was cruel and so I listened to the wind, the sand, the stars. They told me what men with machines never hear. That is why I see what others cannot. Her words, though spoken softly, carried the weight of truth. Keller didn't press further. He realized then that Aisha wasn't simply a soldier with a rifle. She was something forged by hardship, tempered by the land itself. The others might still think of her as a mystery, but Keller began to see her as their only hope. When dawn finally crept across the horizon, the camp stirred to life. The men moved quietly, preparing their meager supplies, rechecking their weapons and casting nervous glances toward the direction where the enemy would soon emerge. Aisha stood before the sun even broke, already scanning the landscape through her scope. She adjusted for the faintest wind, for the shimmer of heat rising even in the early morning air. Every detail was etched into her mind, every potential movement accounted for. The attack came swiftly. Distant engines roared, and clouds of dust rose against the brightening sky. The enemy had brought vehicles this time, heavy and armed, confident in their numbers. The soldiers beside Aisha felt their throats tighten as they realized just how outmatched they were. But Aisha didn't flinch. She settled into position, her breathing steady, her hands unshaking. She waited. Not for the closest target, not for the obvious threat, but for the one strike that would shift the balance again. Her eyes followed the lead vehicle, recognizing the officer standing tall at the mounted gun. A commander barking orders with confidence. He believed the battle was already won. Aisha pressed her cheek against the worn stock, her finger light on the trigger. The wind shifted, and she adjusted without hesitation. Her world narrowed to a single breath, a single heartbeat. When she fired, the sound was almost lost against the roar of engines. The commander fell instantly, his voice silenced mid-command. Chaos erupted. Vehicles swerved, soldiers shouted, confusion spread like wildfire. A single shot, again, had shattered their certainty. The men around her could hardly believe it. They watched through dust and distance as the enemy formation faltered, crumbling without its leader. In that moment, the soldiers who had mocked her no longer saw a woman with a low-end rifle. They saw something else entirely, a force of nature, precise and merciless, turning the tide of battle with nothing more than patience and conviction. As the fight raged on, Aisha kept firing, not recklessly, never wasting a bullet. Each shot was chosen, deliberate, a piece of the battle shifted in their favor. The others fought with renewed courage, emboldened by the knowledge that she was there, covering them, turning impossibility into survival. By the time the sun rose high, the dust had settled. The enemy had retreated again, their advance broken. Around her, the men gasped for breath, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. And once more, silence fell, the kind of silence that was heavier than noise, filled with unspoken awe. Aisha lowered her rifle, her face unreadable. She looked at the men one by one and said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was already written in their eyes. They no longer doubted, no longer mocked. They understood now.